Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Breaking Changes podcast. I'm your host and chief evangelist for Postman, Ken Lane. With Breaking Changes, we explore the world of APIs through the lens of business and engineering leadership. Joining me today, we have Peter Shafton, CTO at ngrok. Peter has just joined ngrok, but he shared with me his view of the API economy from his experience leading architecture for Twilio over the last decade. Well, let's start with the basics. Who are you? What do you do?
Yeah. So my name is Peter Shafton. I am currently the CTO of ngrok. But in a previous life, the last 10 and a half years, I was VP of Architecture and Technology Research at Twilio, which was an API first company as well.
What brought you to APIs? What brought you to Twilio? Did you go there thinking you were going to do APIs, or how did it work?
I knew it in a sense. Like, I think I've always, I've always been a big fan of developer tools, things that enable developers to get their jobs done. From the early days at SGI, where I was basically working on OpenGL, which was the graphics APIs to enable you to do and build interesting things with graphics, and then later digital media, the video libraries and things like that. I always loved enabling developers, right? And so one of the things I thought was really slick about Twilio was how easily and quickly you could take that tool set and solve a problem that otherwise would be very challenging for you to solve, right? Like, something that seems trivial, like sending a text message, turns out is not that trivial to do reliably. And the same is true for phone calls, right? Like, I could probably initiate an outbound phone call that sent you an audio file, but it would be much harder for me to wire that up inbound to something like my web page or some logic. And so I think it's very empowering. Like, I like building tools. I like doing things that enable me as a developer to do things more easily. So effectively, I'm building tools for myself. I am the audience, but it turns out other developers find that useful.
Yeah, Twilio really, I mean, it's kind of the pinnacle of what we showcase when it comes to making developers' lives easier, from what the resource is, SMS, voice, to the onboarding experience, to the overall developer experience, it working well, reliably, all those things. So what's the biggest challenge doing APIs for you during your time at Twilio? What did you see as the hardest problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a few problems. One is the APIs are sort of forever, right? Like, once you put them out there, you don't really know who's built against you, more or less, and you can't easily get them to move. So if you made a bad decision, you sort of have to live with it for a long period of time. It's sort of the equivalent of like where you decide to put electrical outlets or network wiring in your house. You can do it after the fact, but it's pretty painful to go back and change that. And so APIs are the same way. I think that's the hardest part. Have I thought of something? Did I overpromise? Did I give out something that was too complicated to support? A lot of good examples. Like, as an example, we allowed you to do something called deep paging at Twilio early on, which basically meant like, hey, here's your result set. And I know you've like a list of all the text messages you've sent in all your time of using Twilio. I'd like to jump into the 10,000th page, right? Sorted by time. That was an API that was really useful to developers, but almost impossible for us to implement internally. And so I think those are the challenges, like where you're thoughtful about which things are going to bite me. Did I give myself an ability to upgrade versions? How do I split traffic or split customers? And I think in most of us build in a multi-tenant world now, which meant that if this is wildly successful, customer A can effectively stomp the capacity or infrastructure support for customer B. And in a perfect world, you wouldn't want to. Those are the biggest challenges for sure: scale and permanence.
In the space, we use the phrase API first a lot. What does that mean to you? What does API first mean to you?
I mean, it basically means that as you're thinking through a capability or a feature or something you want to do, there's got to be a way to do it through an API. Like, that is how you're thinking about it. If there's a user interface or another way to achieve the same outcome, you have to make sure that it also can be driven by an API. If you kind of don't think of it that way, then you've effectively limited who and what can use your service and how, right? And so if you can't script it, if you can't control it programmatically, then you very much limited certainly the developer customer base. And I've seen developers do crazy things for products or capabilities that didn't have an API, right? You see them scrape web pages, you see them programmatically do HTTP posts because somebody didn't create an API for it. And I had a fun story when I was at a startup, this company called Virage, when we did video image recognition. So we extracted metadata from video. And I had an engineer there who had built a piece of software that did speech to text. And it had this crazy interface. I couldn't understand why he had created the crazy API. And I realized he'd ended up wrapping the sample that had shipped with this company's product. And he didn't realize that he could have just written to their SDK directly. And so effectively, the interface that he was writing to was a CLI, was a command line program. And so it gets you to think, like, people do crazy stuff like to make it work together. But if you don't create an API, if that isn't your first thought, then you're just making it really difficult to use what you've got in creative ways.
When I first woke up to Twilio, I remember when Jeff first came on the scene and was pushing it to developers. I was one of those developers, and I was like, all right, this is really speaks to me because it's API first. It's really speaks to my needs. SMS is a large scope thing that I have trouble doing on my own. Like, I don't know the telco network. I don't know all of this realm. And Jeff and y'all are going to figure this out for me. Over the years, though, I've really seen Twilio as more of an enabler of much, much more. Like, all of the API economy level stuff, like delivery apps, like it enabled, SMS at that level, that ease enabled so many more other ecosystems. Did you see that early on, or was it just pretty hyper focus on, hey, the direct consumers of SMS and the resources we're making available?
No, I mean, I think we very much saw the niche we were providing, right? Like, and this was Jeff's vision early on, long before I got there. If you look at his trajectory, he had always worked for companies that had a pretty important service component, right? Like, when I say work for, Jeff really started little startups, right? His first one was a university lecture note company, right? So at school, they would take lecture notes, right? But the trick of all these things is, how do you communicate with your customer, right? How do you notify them that the notes are ready? How did you communicate? He did the same thing when he did StubHub, right? It's like, how do you tell somebody that somebody wants to buy your ticket, right? Because finding that out a week later when they check their email or whatever is not useful. You got to know right now. And they're like, oh yeah, I want to sell the ticket right now. And so he very much saw the need for communication to be part of it. And that being a very challenging thing for him, and why he created Twilio. And I think we early on knew that making that easy enabled a bunch of things. Now, what we didn't have the visibility is to see all of the places where that would happen, right? Like the creation of Uber, which eventually led into DoorDash and a bunch of other things, which obviously for the last 2 years has been serious for us. And that shift of the customer experience that it created would just raise the bar for everybody, right? Like, we effectively decimated the taxi industry, right? Indirectly. Because in the old days, and in the Bay Area, when you order a taxi, you call and you say, I want a taxi. And they go, great, we'll send you a taxi. And an hour later, maybe the taxi shows up, maybe it doesn't. You don't know. You call again. You have no visibility into that. And to change that into a model where it's like, no, like, we're going to tell you in the taxi, we're going to tell you who the driver is. We'll let you know, right? That communication part of the business is as important as the actual delivery of the service. And so the same thing is true. Like, you're tracking your food now, right? When you order it, you know it's coming, you know when they picked it up from the restaurant, you know when the driver's headed to the restaurant. Like, now that is the bar for all these other companies, right? For banks and for every service industry. And so the trick is, well, okay, now that you've raised the bar, what does everybody have to do to get there, right? And the answer is, well, they all got to go write messaging and voice code. Nobody's going to do that, right? And I think you probably went through the whole same phase. Like, there was a point in time where web pages were all static, right? And then they started to become dynamic. Like, I'll just stay on the page and the data will update dynamically as things are changing. And when we first did that, it was all Ajax code, right? Somebody would figure out how to write Ajax code that worked in every version of every browser. And it was crazy, right? It was a nightmare for a developer. And eventually you started to get jQuery and other libraries that made it a lot easier for everybody to kind of have dynamic web pages. But I think for Twilio, it's exactly that. It just raised the bar and enabled this set of capability that everybody expected to have ubiquitously. Um, so I think we saw the possibility. I don't think we understood how far it went and how many industries would be affected. And I think the funny thing about Twilio is there's still a fraction of the world that's even adopted that, right? You look at how many have not and how many industries have not.
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting to watch telco industry wake up to it. It took a while for them to even see Twilio from the old guard telco folks I know. At least they were like, what is this thing? And then they start, well, this thing is interesting. And then it became a little bit more threat level, but it's still compared to the overall global telco market. Like I think there's a lot of interesting things there for them, but they're big dinosaurs. So I think it's the same for a lot of the other industries. Taxi, I think it took them a while to wake up to Uber, a little bit faster, I think. But I think that communication piece is interesting. So do you think the average enterprise? I mean, everyone's an API company nowadays. It's really gone mainstream. And do you think that communication factor is really where people should be focusing on? Is that making it real time and making it really personal on that level?
Well, I think it's an important part of the business, right? Like it's important. It is, it's not the only thing, right? Like as a company, you have to figure out, how do I bill efficiently, right? How do I accept a bunch of different payment forms? How do I, have a channel for the customer to communicate with me? But I think our expectations of what a company will do and how it will interact with its customers has changed. And so if you don't have that, it almost feels antiquated, right? Like you see people communicating with companies via Twitter, right? You used to call and sit on the 1-800 helpline for hours and just deal with that is the only way to communicate with the company. And I think your expectation has changed significantly. I think the tricky part is, how does a company do that at scale? Like we saw, Twilio built a call center product called Flex, right? And so we saw this shift from voice-based support to text-based support, right? Either text messages or email, where a support person can handle thousands of them or dozens of them at the same time, as opposed to I can only be on one phone call at a time, right? And so my ability to service customers in this synchronous fashion is much, much harder. And so that is an important shift. But I think you would hit on something that was interesting too. Like for the telcos, introducing APIs after the fact is very challenging, right? Like if your infrastructure was not stood up to support those use cases, it looked a lot like that guy who worked for me, right? Wrapping a sample app. Like there was no hook, right, to basically go in and get the result back. Like all I could do is whatever came out on standard out and try to parse it in some crazy way. It was us parsing the web page. And so for these guys, like, okay, I'm AT&T and I want to create an API to allow somebody to make a phone call. Like that is not at all how my infrastructure works, right? Infrastructure makes phone calls. They initiate by somebody in. Like, where would I add that hook? And how do I deal with back pressure and scale? And like, it just wasn't a thought. And that's why it was so hard for them to make that shift. And I've talked to a bunch of other companies that are doing the same thing. Like we built this thing and like, the way you configure it is through the web page, right? You come in and we generate this enormous JSON blob that is all the parameters we need to pass. We pass it all back in one call because we have an HTTP post, and then we stand up all the structures we need on the server side. And now you're like, okay, like how do I make an API out of that? I don't know. I didn't deconstruct it into its residual parts, and what can you do and not do? And it turns out that's a really hard thing to do well.
I think you really touched on the heart of, for me, like why APIs matter, why being API first and seeing the world in APIs, because it's going to allow you to evolve quicker, respond to things. So can you speak to how API first allowed, because Twilio's responded to quite a few things. I mean, been quite a few acquisitions. You guys got into building some apps. So I'm guessing this was in response to changes or opportunities you saw. And how did being API first, allow you guys to respond to those?
No, I mean, I think that's a good way to think about it, right? Like there was, if you think back, different companies tackle APIs in different ways, right? I think Twilio's approach was very Unix-like. When you think about, in the early days of Unix, you had tools and they did a simple action and they usually had a simple output, but you could pipe them together, right? They had simple things like T and pipe and sort and grep and unique, that each of these tools that kind of did a thing, but you could wire them together and have different outputs, right? Different outcomes. So like using these simple tools. And so Twilio was very much the same thing. Like here's a thing that you can tell it what message to send. You can tell it the body, you can tell it who to talk to, but that's all it does, right? And the same thing is I can initiate a phone call, but at each flow in that process, I can tell it a simple thing to do. And with those simple capabilities, it meant that you could build more complex use cases on top of it. And again, this was a thing that was difficult for incumbents to do. And as we saw people building call centers or marketing products on top of it, it was pretty easy for us to build a solution that allowed all the flexibility of what was under the covers as a product on top. That would have been very hard for somebody else to do because we already had all the building blocks. Like you want to add people to a conference, you want to move them for the conference, you want some participants to be on video and some participants to be on a telephone call. Like we have all that. Like we have all those pieces. And as we looked for acquisitions, we looked for companies that were API first, right? There was no surprise that we acquired, SendGrid because they were an API first email company, right? Like it was very easy to see how naturally these two would fit together, right? You want to call into your call center, but also send emails as a mechanism of getting support. Guess what? SendGrid already does all that. Like those wires to connect into our infrastructure was fairly easy. And Segment the same way, right? A company that is programmatically driven. And so there were a lot of companies that wouldn't have fit well in that culture and wouldn't have fit well in that environment. But for Twilio, those building blocks made it easy to move.
And those acquisitions, I'm assuming, were a lot. The friction was lessened or reduced because they were API first and because Twilio's API first. So there are things that are going to have to be smoothed out. But I'm guessing it made those a lot easier and quicker.
I think that it was less friction for our customers, hopefully, although it's not entirely true because of a lot of the internal things. But most of the friction came from us internally, right? Like, okay, we're API first, but like, how did we stand up our APIs inside, right? What did we enable? It's funny, Jeff talks about, being interface driven as a company, right? Like we have APIs for our customers and we have APIs between teams, right? If you read his book, he sort of talks about this. And the reality was Twilio actually was not built that way internally at first. It was a database-centric architecture where all the communication happened in the database. One service would write something, another service would pull the database and see the change and act on it, as opposed to, as you would think, that two services would hit each other through REST APIs and initiate the changes. We eventually got there. That was not where we started. And so APIs over time has changed, right? And the API, if you think of the early days, we ran into this a lot. You do a REST operation, right? You break your logic or your infrastructure up into these models, and these models would each have an interface, right? So you'd say conceptually, there is an element that is a message, right? And if I want to get all the messages, I just hit the list resource and get all of the messages, right? But it means some things you want to do, like show me the messages as they're coming in, or a company like Uber, and it turns out you're sending 50,000 messages a second, not 1,000 messages a second, right? And I can only page through 1,000 records at a time. Like, I cannot get my messages this way, right? It was a simple REST API. It made a lot of sense as an interface, but it did not work into the modern world where Segment and others live, where you actually wanted a streaming interface, right? Like, how do the records stream across an interface? And so APIs have to evolve. And we've seen this with GraphQL. We've seen this with Kafka as an interface and other things. And I think that is one of the challenges for data at scale that people learn, right? You start with REST because it's simple. You have a JSON payload. It makes a lot of sense. And then you try to build an interface or a product on top of it, and you realize at scale, round-tripping 1,000 REST requests to build up a page doesn't work, right? And so the question is, it was great for sending a message. It was great for initiating a phone call. It wasn't great for show me the messages from last month.
So what's the decision-making process and how you chose Kafka, went with different technologies? Was it purely technical? Was it about how it handled data? What was some of the thinking that went into those evolutions?
Yeah, I mean, we were forced to deal with it because of scale, right? And there's things are changing now. You have ELT and other mechanisms of accessing data, and the ecosystem has changed, right? In the early world, you collected data and it only went to you, You'd build a BI system, it would sit in S3 and you'd have Redshift and you'd query your data and that's where it went. And then the customers started to want their own data back, like it was theirs conceptually. And so how do you give it to them in a way that is convenient and makes sense? And this is where Segment and all these other companies starting to live now, right? In this world where what is the data interface? And I think we had to evolve with that time. You'll see that there's an event stream product that's part of Twilio now that allows you to effectively subscribe to a product. Send me all of the messages when they happen, right, as they change, all the phone calls as they happen. Send them over this interface. They will stream into my infrastructure. Kafka is one of those ways, although Kafka is much more common for an internal interface, right, that decide how do you send data over the wire, right? Are you using JSON schema? Are you using Avro? What do those interfaces look like? What infrastructures do you connect into in GCP or Azure or AWS? Those become the data interfaces, and they're as important, for setting up these almost streaming pipelines, more than like I'm hitting an API and I'm getting a result, right?
Yeah, those partner influences and external influences definitely shaping technical decisions more and more. Was there a lot of regulatory that influenced your decision making along these lines as well?
It's an interesting battle. Like there was so Twilio, I drove something called GDPR at Twilio. That was my responsibility, among other things. And there were two vectors inside, right? One was this world where you say, listen, and Twilio was unique in some respects, maybe not unique compared to others, but we had a lot of sensitive data, right? We have the body of the text message you just sent, and watching what's happened with the January 6th, investigation and other things, having the bodies of text messages is pretty important and very dangerous in a lot of cases, right? You can imagine we also have the recordings of audio calls, and potentially a packet capture of audios, of phone calls in times. And so one vector is, listen, we're going to go towards zero, right? Our goal is to retain nothing. As a customer, we'll give you a flag that says, listen, as soon as we have sent that text message, we will purge any record of it from all of our systems, right? We won't even keep a record of the fact that you sent it, because that's what you'll want, right? It's a good way to achieve GDPR. And guess what? We don't have to retain data. Our storage systems get smaller. This is a great story, right? And then you think about, well, what is the value of a company? Like, is it more valuable that I throw away all your data, because that way you don't have to worry about using me? Think about Google not retaining any of your web searches. Or is it more important that I have it, but give it back to you in some valuable way, right? Like you trust me, I'm going to encrypt it when I have it. Nobody can steal it from me. And when you want it back, I'll give it to you in any way you want it, right? You can filter it, you can order it, you can sort it, but you can also tell me to delete swaths of it. We felt like that was a much better story, right? As a company, I would rather be the company that owned all your data and just was great, arbiters of it, than the company that just purged all your data. And it actually, if you think about the corollary, is a company like PayPal, right, or Stripe or somebody, where as a company, we don't keep credit cards, right? Like none of us would stand up a business right now where we say, yeah, go ahead and put your credit card into my web form and we'll store it in a database for you, right? Your credit card number and your your CVS number and all those things. And we'll just use it when you want to make a payment. Like you'd think we were crazy, right? What we do is we hand it all to Stripe or PayPal. You actually interact with them directly. We get this opaque token. We don't even know what the heck it is, but when we want to charge, we ask them to charge it on your behalf and they manage it, right? Their problem. Their systems don't get breached. Conceptually, we want Twilio to be the same thing. Like, would you want to be the company that is retaining all of the text messages that were your interactions with your customers? Or would you much rather have Twilio hold all that data, knowing that if you needed it, you could go ask, like, hey, Peter had some interaction with my support team last month. What did he send? And what did they respond to him with? But I don't want to keep that in all my systems because God forbid somebody breaches my system and my database. Now I'm responsible for all this proprietary, this PII data. And so that was a big path for us and a shift internally to say, no. Like we want to be the company that retains data, but we're going to do it right. And that was a lot with the thinking around Segment, right? We want to acquire Segment. What do they do? How do we retain and store data?
Yeah, that's because we need a whole stack of those types of companies to kind of the back end as a service. I need I need my payments, I need my storage, I need my messaging, I need my core stack, and they've got to be people I trust and
Right.
that aren't going to screw it up.
Yeah. No, it's tricky. Like I think, it was funny. We went down the GDPR path. I had meetings with a bunch of companies. And one of the companies I talked to was Autodesk, right? And so it's funny, we get paired together and we have these long conversations. Autodesk has been around for 40 some odd years.
Yeah.
And they said, well, yeah, we're doing GDPR. What do you guys do? I said, we have this event that comes through. Somebody says, hey, this is my account. I want you to delete it. And so we just walk the database. Like we put an event on Kafka, all the systems listen to the Kafka bus, and then we just purge the data from the database, right? And then in the backups will age out after 30 days and your data's gone. Like, poof. I said, well, how are you guys tackling it? They said, well, they're like, so it turns out like we have about 50 databases. Some of them are fronted by COBOL code. Nobody can read or write anymore. Your email address might be in some of them. We're not sure. If you gave it at a conference, one of our marketing guys might have sent it. We may be sending you emails out of one system, or text messages out of another system, or we're not sure. So what we're going to do is we're going to open a Zendesk ticket, and we'll CC a bunch of engineers and people on it. And everybody's job is to look at those tickets every month and go log on to those databases and purge the records you're supposed to purge. So effectively Mechanical Turk. And I said, oh shit, really? They said, we don't have another choice. Like there's no APIs between these. These systems are totally disconnected. We can't do anything else. And it gives you that shift of like, well, oh God, right? Data has become very important in APIs and how you handle it, how you control it, how quickly you can ask to delete it, what happens.
Yeah. It's I worked for the Obama administration he did the open data mandate that all top level cabinet agencies needed to go machine readable by default for any public data. So it's got to be publicly available as JSON and XML. And I'm the guy who went around to different agencies telling them they needed to do this and get ready for the deadline. And people were like, what's JSON? What's XML? What do you mean? Like I manage this spreadsheet and it sits on my desktop computer and I email out reports to people. And like, how am I supposed to, it's like, so trying to migrate these legacy processes and people. And I mean, it just really speaks to the importance of APIs and getting that foundation laid because it's so key to the future and everything now, whether it's business, regulation or anything. So, can't agree more. What's the favorite thing you did over the last decade at Twilio?
I have a piece that I really enjoyed working on. It became and derived into two different things. At first, so we used to, obviously you can imagine all the phone calls that go across Twilio system, and that all used SIP as the protocol. And so in the early days, we had basically two servers that sat on the edge that communicated with the carrier infrastructure, right? And so if you needed to debug a phone call, like, hey, what happened? Why did that call not complete? Why did it take so long? Why did the carrier hang up on us? Did they hang up on us or was it, the user? We would literally log on to one of those two servers, actually log on to both because you don't know which one it hit, and go find that call, right? So you can imagine that was going to be hard to scale over time. And eventually, Twilio's infrastructure became global, and a phone call would actually take sometimes up to 11 hops for the SIP stack, right? It would go through a bunch of internal servers. It might go through an edge gateway. It would get rerouted to another region because it turned out the guy on the other end of the call was in Paris. And so I built a system we called Call Meta that basically did a packet capture at the network layer, decoded the SIP protocol, and stored and extracted metadata in a distributed database system. And so the idea was you could effectively ask it about a phone call and say, go find me all the packet captures related to this phone call, cobble them back together and draw me a ladder graph, right? So I can see which servers did this go through, what happened, who did what, where was latency introduced or not. And it turned out you could repurpose that to start to see patterns of like, listen, are we seeing increased latency through a single availability zone, through a single region, one single egress point? Like, is it one of our servers, one of the media servers in a carrier side that's gone bad? Or everything related to a region of the country, right? Like, did somebody sever a transatlantic cable, and therefore all the calls related to, destination Belgium from New York are kaput, right? And so that was a lot of fun. Like, it was a lot of fun to build a system that dealt with the protocol, that thought about how am I going to store the data, how am I going to scale it? I can't retain this forever. Um, and what interface would a support person want or need, such that they could go reach out to the carrier and go, hey, listen, we need to escalate. This is the issue. So that was fun. It was a fun system to build and work on over time.
Yeah, those scope of problems. The data, this is what I love. I'm an old database guy since the 80s, been doing databases. So I really love the explosion of metadata. But then you kept saying it, see. I want to be able to see. And I really feel like that's a key part of our worlds right now, is helping people see this virtual realm. And that's kind of the Segment acquisition, I would say, to a certain degree.
Yep.
It makes it viewable, makes it manageable. Like these things are such large problems. Any way we can get help to see things and manage them is valuable.
Yeah, and Segment was interesting, and it brought in, if you think about Twilio, it has the communication protocol. Like, we know when you make the phone call, we know when you send the text messages, but aside from your phone number, we don't know who you are, right? We know nothing about you. You may have spent an hour on the Nike website looking at shoes and then decided you were going to call support, right? Or we may have initiated a text message out to you to say, listen, here's 20% off this cool new pair of sneakers, right? But for Twilio, I don't know you're you. The only thing I know is that here's a string of text I sent to a phone number. Whether it's yours or not, I don't know either. Segment brought in the marriage of that other set of data that came from your website and from your CRM system and all those pieces. And so being able to combine those two is really the value prop in many ways, right? If you think about it as a support person, if when you called in, it pulled up the rest of your record, right? Showed you your purchase history, showed me your interactions and your name and email address, right? That is where the nirvana is, right? And the marketing system conceptually the same thing.
Yeah.
But we always lacked that data and that visibility. Yeah, we had no context.
Yeah. It's the context you need to understand what's this log file I'm looking at, or whatever I'm looking at. It gives it meaning for sure.
That's right.
So
what was your transactional company? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that context, that meaning to the humans, I think is where the real value is. Cause then not just the end users, but us as the startups and business people, we can connect the dots in more meaningful, purposeful ways that make our lives better, rather than just tech for the sake of tech.
No, absolutely.
So you moved on. You're at ngrok now. What are you going to be doing there?
So my role there is CTO. Again, this is a technology story. It's similar to Twilio in many ways. It is a tool that enables people, to bring their logic and their code and their servers to the rest of the world, right? Like, if you think about, there's two challenges. One is, did I make an API, right? Like we talked about that for the last half hour or more, right? How easy is it to use? What does it look like? The second thing is like, well, how do I get that out to the rest of the world? I think Postman deals with like, how do I find it? How did I know it was there? What does it look like? How do I use it? But I tactically, as an engineer within a software company, have to figure out, how do I expose it? And how do I do it safely? And how do I do it at scale? And so for a lot of folks, that turns out that's really hard to do. And ngrok really fulfills that niche, that makes it really easy, either as a developer during the developer flow of exposing something I'm playing with before I'm ready for the rest of the world to see it yet, or exposing something when I'm not knowledgeable about how to scale it and make it available, or for controlling access to something. Like, listen, I want to put it out there, but I only want people that authenticate through Google. I want to know who they are. I want to make sure the sessions are protected. I don't want to have visibility and those things. And so ngrok really represents that tool chain and that part of the developer ecosystem. Like, it fulfills a part of the problem that I hadn't seen a lot of companies do well, right? And so I'll be hoping, form both the product direction and the technical direction. Like, how do they build that at scale? How do you get observability at scale? And it's a thing that just really has to work, which is hard. Like, I think you guys have, Postman's in a very similar path where it's like, listen, while I was in the developer flow, it was fine. Like, using, you've written your Postman scripts, you're using ngrok, I'm developing my website, ngrok's down, Postman's down. It's like, it sucks. I'll go grab coffee. I'll come back. They'll probably be back online. I'll go continue what I was doing, right? And then there's the shift, right? Where it's like, well, no, like, my app is built on Postman. Like every web request that comes through goes through Postman, right? Or my app is standing on top of ngrok. And now, like the latency matters, the uptime matters. I can't just do deploys where I take down the database and bring it back up an hour later. Like it just all has to be up all the time. And so for me, that's sort of the fun. Like, how do you operate this stuff at scale? How do you build it so that a few engineers can basically manage an infrastructure for thousands? Otherwise, I'm hiring thousands of engineers.
Yeah, and do it at scale, but do it with the reliability, the quality, and do more with less. Because you said small teams, we've got to really be as efficient as we can and handle these loads. So,
Yeah.
Well, I think I'll hit you up in maybe a year, come back and talk to me about what it looks like and see what the landscape, because I think that's, especially with devices and things being connected to the internet. I mean, web and mobile, yeah, I'm excited about, but I think the connecting everyday objects to the internet and doing that in a reliably efficient, logical way, safe, secure, regulatory compliant, all of that, I think is going to be super interesting. And that's what I see ngrok at the center of. So,
yeah, no, I mean, I think we're in very similar journeys, right? I think we tackle different parts of the problem, but for what effectively is like, hey, I've got a thing I want the world to see or use, and or even a segment of the world, help me do that, right? Like I think we have learned over time what is hard about that, what's hard about defining an API that lives on, what is hard about scaling an infrastructure that makes it easy. But not everybody has the luxury, and they're going to want to stand up on stuff. And we've learned the same thing with AWS, right? Like, yeah, I mean, you've been around long enough. We used to rack servers, right? We used to drag network cables and power and things. Why would I do that again? Like the guys that were great at that were great at that, right? But no startup company could afford those guys. And even if they could, they wouldn't want to hire them. So you pay AWS to do it. You pay them a premium, right? Like I'm renting, a $5,000 box for $1,000 a month, paid for the darn thing in half the month, but I pay for it again and again and again over the year. Why would I do that? The answer is like, I don't have to deal with it, and they know what they're doing.
Well, and it's this evolution for me, the enterprise. I mean, and APIs represent this is SOA within the enterprise, very behind the firewall. And then APIs kind of jumped out of the SOA toolbox. Web APIs kind of fueled mobile. We had this public explosion that gave us Twilio and Stripe and others. But then we have this microservices evolution, which is, again, turning internally, I think, and using services. But now I think it's just the world, like we're just all operating on the internet. Like there's no behind the firewall. There's just, I've got this thing I want to show. Here, put it up there. Help me do it safely, securely.
Yeah, it's the safely and securely part that I think it scares the bejesus out of most of us, right? We don't realize, as we all start living on the same infrastructure and the same things, if somebody messes something up, we all kind of go down for the run. Like we learned it with Log4j and other pieces, right? Where it's like, somebody messed something up and we're all using it. Now what?
Yeah.
And so that's scary.
Thanks for coming by and having this conversation with me. I really appreciate your insight and look forward to maybe having this conversation again down the road.
No, that'd be great, Ken. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to Peter for stopping by. For more on Peter, you can find him on LinkedIn, or you can see what he's building at ngrok.com. You can also subscribe to the Breaking Changes podcast at postman.com/events/breaking-changes. I'm your host, Ken Lane, and until next time, cheers.